Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of All Now with Alex. I'm your host, of course, Alex. Today we have a very special guest with us in the building, Mr. Brian. How you doing today, sir?
I'm doing good, Alex. Thanks for having me. How are you?
Good. I'm good. I can't complain. Now, is your last name pronounced Sachetta?
You got it.
Okay, all right. I butcher names sometimes, so I like to try it though, because I'm like, you know what? I usually, I'm like, I usually pretty close, so I figure I try.
Yeah, and no worries. That's not something I take offense to. So you got it.
All right. So, can you give people a little bit of background about yourself before we dive into the questions?
For sure. So I'm Brian Sachetta. I'm an author, blogger, software developer. I come to the mental health space trying to help people, right? So I've been through anxiety and depression in my own life. I have a lot of personal experience there. And as I went through some of those experiences, it really the challenges came to the forefront and really made me realize that mental health was sort of my battle, right? Something that was sort of the prevailing fight that I had to go fight in my own life. And so, after many years of fighting that battle and coming to terms with anxiety and depression and coming up with tactics for navigating them and dealing with them and all that, I turned around and I said, this is a really important subject matter to me. And it feels as though my soul is kind of tied up in it, right? I care so much about this, not just for myself, but for others. I see the suffering that is in other people where they experience anxiety and depression themselves. And so eventually I turned around and I said, I want to take this information and do something positive with it. And that's how my brand arose, of writing my books and writing my blogs and getting on podcasts and whatnot. So that's me in a nutshell, is just, going out there trying to be a little bit of a thought leader and just help folks with the struggle that can be known as mental illness.
Okay, cool. So I guess let's jump right into it. So I know you were saying, you were in the software development space, and then now you're more so in the mental health space. Like, was there something that, that caused you to just jump straight into it? Like, was it something in your life, or was it just something you noticed that the world was missing and you decided to jump in? Like, what was that defining moment that said, you know what, I need to be more so in the mental health area?
Yeah, so I will admit that I am still in both areas, right? So my full-time job is software development. As an artist or a creator, whatever you want to call it, right? As an author, it's still hard, like, to create, to generate income off of your books and to make an income stream off of content. And so how I look at this is basically my passion is the mental health and the writing, or helping people in any way I can through the lessons I've learned on the mental health front, until I get to the point of being able to support myself through those ventures. I'm like, hey, I enjoy software development. That's what I went to school for. I have been doing that for the last 12-ish years. I think it might be 13 at this point. I can't even totally remember. But so, I basically keep the lights on and pay my bills with my software development job. And then nights and weekends, I'm working on the Get Out of Your Head brand, which is my brand for the mental health stuff. Answering the question you asked of, like, was there a moment in time in which you said, you needed to make the jump? So even though I'm not full-time in the writing, it was somewhere around 2015, 2016, 2017. And even though that's a wide gap, I'll give you the breakdown, right? So basically, I had struggled really hard with anxiety since I was 17, 18 years old. So that would have been 2008, pretty much. And so over the course of 7 years, it was, what was happening was right. I was experiencing anxiety and depression in my own life. I'd go to different situations that made me nervous. I'd give a speech in front of class, and that would make me nervous. And, I'm not trying to say that anything that I've been through has been, like, remarkable, right? I think what is helpful or interesting about my brand, I would like to think, is that I'm trying to talk about things that are everyday occurrences that a lot of people struggle with, right? And so hopefully it's relatable. And so for those 7-ish years, again, about 2008 to 2015, I was going through a lot of those experiences, right? And it was like, okay, I have to go to a job interview and I really want this job, but I'm super nervous about it. And I just don't know how to handle this. And so after enough of those years, let's say 7-ish, I started to look back and say, okay, I have been reading different material, whether it's a book, listening to a book on tape, reading a journal article, listening to a podcast, whatever, right? Synthesizing a lot of different information in the mental health space, and sort of unknowingly at first, applying a lot of the ideas that I had learned through those mediums in these different anxiety, like, and again, I'm not trying to make it sound as though what I have been through is like the worst thing on earth, because it's not, right? But again, it's trying to be relatable, right? Where it's like, I put my hand up and say, what really caused me to write my first book was I had been sort of seeing this girl and I was really into her. And then she went on vacation, a really long vacation. And the way that my mind works, right? Like and I think a lot of people could probably relate to this, which is like, I had decided, I was like, I'm all in on this relationship, but I just wasn't there from a perspective of like, I was not good emotionally. I didn't know how to have conversations. I didn't know how to broach the subject and really like tell her, hey, this is what I want, right? And this is what I'm seeking. I was, and maybe I tried a little bit, but I wasn't that great at it. And so basically what happened was, for that summer, I was just so anxious. Like I was so into this girl. I'm like, honestly, I really think that things could go somewhere with this person, right? And I've had some struggles in the past where I was like, I think this could be a good one, right? And so I was nervous and all that. And throughout that summer, I was just every day, I was very, very anxious. And, again, not trying to say that I had a reason for that. Again, it's like I was lucky to be able to be anxious over this thing and not something much larger and more important in my life. But it felt really large and really important at the time. And so at the end of that summer, right, it was like, again, just being anxious every day about where this is going. And part of this was, what I realized was it wasn't really about that relationship or about that girl, that woman, right? It was more about me figuring out, like, having sort of a hard conversation with myself and being like, what this situation is revealing to me is that I need to learn a lot of stuff here, not only on the relationship front, but also on the mental health front. And so maybe what ends up happening, and I was resistant to it at the time, but I was like, maybe what ends up happening here is I learn a lot about dealing with my own anxiety through this experience. And maybe the relationship doesn't come to fruition in the way I want it, but I will leave this situation in a better place because I have these tools that I can use for my own mental health. And so, long and short, right, the relationship did not work out. But at some point during that summer, a light bulb really went off in my head. And I was like, wow, all these different ideas that I have kind of been ping ponging in my mind over the last however many years, I finally understand a lot of them and I am using them. And I'm trying to help myself feel better from a mental health perspective on a regular basis. And so eventually during that summer, right, I was like, okay, I'm not going to say I have it all figured out, but I think this experience has taught me a lot of critical things. And eventually I turned around and said, okay, because I feel that way, I feel as though I am uh, not authorized. What's the right word? I feel justified in talking about these different tactics and approaches to my own mental health and trying to help other people with their mental health. So that was 2015. And why I say 2015 and 2017 was 2015 was where I had the light bulb moment of like, okay, I've got all these ideas. I have something of a framework for helping people with their own mental health because I'm helping myself. And then between 2015 and 2017 is where I started really formulating ideas, putting ideas on paper and writing my first book. And then I released it in 2018. Obviously, there's a big editing process that goes on there, but that was sort of like, that was the real, even though there are other anxiety related stories that I tell throughout my books, it's like that was the meat and potatoes of that first book. That's what really got me to put pen to paper.
Okay. Okay. Um, is that the go get out of your head book series? Was that like the first installment of that?
Yep. So that one is Get Out of Your Head, a toolkit for living with and overcoming anxiety.
Okay. Okay. Um, okay. So, are there any? Can you explain any key parallels that you've drawn between computer systems and the human mind?
Yeah. So, as we were talking about, right, was basically I still am a full-time software developer and I do my writing on the side. So how I like to approach this or talk about it is basically in saying that, you do anything for a long enough period of time. If you have a full-time job and then you have a side hustle, whatever it is, you will eventually start to see similarities between those two things, even if they only sort of exist, or maybe they exist like a lot of them, right? But you will start to see those parallels because you spend so much time and dedicate so much energy to those ventures. And so I do think there are a lot of similarities between mental health and computer systems. At the same time, it's just the nature of the beast, right? Where I spend 40 hours a week writing software and then I spend another 20-ish hours on the brand, right? And so some of the ideas that I had talked about in, not only my books, but also some of my blog articles, we could delve into here. So the first one being, right, is just the notion of, in computer science, there's this program, or excuse me, there's this concept called recursion. And so basically what recursion is in a software program, you have your code that you write, and the code is broken up into different blocks, which are called functions, right? So, for example, if you wanted your code to do something specifically, you would write a function that kind of almost has like a verb to it, right? So it would say like, turn on the lights, or change the number displayed on the screen, whatever you want to call it, or whatever that action is that you're trying to have taken. And so some of these functions or these methods or actions, they can call themselves, right? So there, it's kind of hard to give an example without going too deep. But just think of that, right? Where you're basically like, you have this action that does a thing, and while it's doing that thing, it then calls that action yet again, right? So you end up getting into this loop, if you will, right? Where if that action is repeatedly calling itself until there is some marker that says, stop calling yourself, it's going to continue doing that, right? So it's going to go into a loop. So what I like to say to folks is that often our anxiety, and I would say kind of every struggle on the mental health front, can become recursive, in the sense that it can call itself, or we can use our minds to keep calling our minds. So when we are fearful, right, we're running this function in our mind. Obviously, it's not real code or anything like that, but that's the parallel. And so we're running code in our minds that's like, run some anxious pattern, think a scary thought. And as we are thinking those scary thoughts, there are feelings that arise in us that provoke more fear and cause us to think even more scary thoughts, right? So it's that recursive nature of the anxiety calls the anxiety, calls the anxiety again. We get even more anxious. So in computer science or in programming, right, when you're dealing with a recursive function, what you really need to do is you need to establish what your base cases are, or what your breakout cases are. So for example, right, if I wanted to do something 10 times, I may say, okay, call this function and pass in a parameter of a certain number. And maybe that parameter is 10, right? That number is 10. And then within that function, that number is getting decremented, right? So it's going to 9, and then the function gets called again with 9, and then it gets called again with 8. And by the time you get to 0, that function knows to stop running the function itself, right? To break out of that loop that it's in. So what I say to folks is, we basically need to come up with these same base cases for ourselves. We need to be able to say, okay, I have the awareness that I am running this looping in my mind, right? And my base cases or my breakout cases are maybe having that awareness and going for a walk, having that awareness and doing 10 jumping jacks, running around the block, saying something to myself that gets me inspired or pumped up or distracted, right? So again, just trying to draw these parallels between computer systems or computer science and mental health. Yeah. So that way I can give some maybe sort of like concrete examples that relate to people. Obviously, those examples are probably more likely to be relatable to folks who are in the tech world. But I don't know. That's where I come at this from. So that's what I know how to talk about.
Yeah. I mean, and that's understandable. I mean, when people sit there and they actually, because I'm not necessarily in the tech world. I mean, I know a little bit about computers and things like that, but I wouldn't call myself being in the tech world, to have that much knowledge. But I do understand what you're saying as far as, it calling that same action until something tells it to stop. I mean, is what some people think of like a robot. It'll keep doing what you tell it to do until you tell it to stop, or until you tell it, hey, like, hey, if it has this robot picking up all the apples out of this basket, once you reach in and you don't feel anything, it knows to stop, or something like that. I don't know.
Exactly. And it's like we can be robotic, but we are humans. And so we want to try to harness that human piece as much as we can. And that's where we sort of inject the agency, right? In being able to say, wait a second, I see what's going on here. It's time to go do something else, rather than just executing the same function passively or without thinking about it reflexively again and again.
Right. So your first book more so addresses like anxiety and things like that, but your second book focuses more probably so on depression. So how does your approach differ when addressing depression versus anxiety?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, I think the approach is sort of reflective of the fact that even though the conditions are related, they're also pretty different, right? So, what I'd like to say is that, and this is probably not even my own term. I think this is just thrown around in general in a positive way, right? Is anxiety and depression are like two peas in a pod or fraternal twins, right? Where they are very closely related, yet at the same time, they are different diseases. What I think is helpful about that related piece, so saying that they are related, is the fact, excuse me, that because they're related, it's almost as if we can bounce from one to the other, or one of the conditions can lead us to the other. So, you say fraternal, you could also say sometimes comorbid, in the sense that, like, if you are an anxious person or you experience anxiety, you are probably more likely to experience depression than somebody who doesn't experience anxiety at all. And so that is, I think that's a similarity that's worth calling out, and just kind of saying, like, the books will be similar, or are similar because they're published, right?
Right.
Because of the fact that the conditions are similar, yet at the same time they are also different enough that the approaches end up being a little bit different. So, to put some actual words behind that, or make that more concrete, I guess what I would say is, if you think of anxiety, in general, not all the time, but it tends to be a little bit more fleeting, right? Where it's like, we have an exam, or we have a first date, or something like that, an important conversation coming up, and we are anxious about that specific thing.
Right.
Once that thing comes to pass, the anxiety with it is gone, right? And not that you can't have generalized anxiety disorder or be anxious for long periods of time. That obviously can happen, but it's sort of like the nature of the body itself, where, like, if you think about anxiety, it's very closely related to the acute stress response in the body, right? Is like, we're scared, or we're facing a threat, and so our body is heightening up for a stress response, or reacting to that threat. That system just can't run forever. And so, by nature of that, anxiety tends to be more of acute battles of, like, oh, something's arising, I have to deal with it, I'm scared about it, whatever, and then it dissipates. Whereas I think depression, and I've been through it before, so my experience of depression is that it is longer in nature. It's not quite like a, hey, I have that job interview next week, I'm depressed about it, and then it's over, and the depression is over. It's more of like and this gets into the definition itself, right? So people will often say, and this is how I describe it in my book, is depression is a pervasive state of helplessness and hopelessness. So it's sort of like internalizing learned helplessness and saying, hey, I don't see, things are bad right now, and I don't see a way in which they're going to get better. Also, I don't see a way in which I can make them better. And so if you operate from that mindset, right, that's a mindset that comes with a relatively long-term timeline associated with it, right? Where, like, if you could change that, if you could change that outlook and say, hey, things are going to get better, then maybe the depression would go away. But when you are really that far in the hole, and thinking that things are, if you're drawn to the point of saying things are so bad that they're irredeemable, right? Then that's something that's a mindset that tends to stick with you for longer. And so, how I approach the second book is, rather than giving people specific tactics to use in the moment and saying, like, hey, where I'm getting at is, like, in my first book, it's a little bit more of that, right? So I say, hey, you're anxious. Why don't you try some deep breathing? Why don't you try, reminding yourself that what you're dealing with is going to pass sooner rather than later, right? Maybe you think about what you're thinking about, and you say to yourself, I'm questioning, my beliefs, my skills, everything I know about the world, how I think certain events are going to unfold. Maybe stop questioning those different things, right? And just put those thoughts down, put those questions down, and see where that gets you. It might, alleviate some of the anxiety. On the depression front, it's much harder to be like, hey, just do this one quick thing and your depression is going to go away, because that's not the nature of the disease itself, right? So
Right.
in the second book, I take a little bit more of a holistic and larger sort of like philosophical approach to the disease. And again, that is depression, right? So how I operate in that book is by saying, like, look, depression is really hard, and I'm not going to sugarcoat that. It's also a large and sort of all-encompassing disease. But at the same time, like, if it's all encompassing, then let's break down what that means, right? So you look at, and I used the word holistic a minute ago. So I would say, let's look at what holistic means. Let's look at what all encompassing means. What are the various factors that are at play there, right? And so there's a framework that I lean on in that book. It's called the biopsychosocial model. So it was developed by these two guys out of the University of Rochester in the 70s. And so they basically say, right, that so I'll just repeat the word so it's clear, right? Biopsychosocial model. Their thought is that various diseases have biological, psychological, and social components to them. And so if you look at a disease through this framework, you can dissect it in a way that allows you to see where that disease or condition stems from. So the framework allows you not only to evaluate the disease itself, but then also potentially to treat it or address it, right? So if we break down that word and say biological, psychological, social, we could say, right, in the context of depression, right, we could say, okay, what are the biological factors on depression? And maybe, right, well, I'll give you the answer, or we'll talk about the answer, right? So there's, for example, it's like, how do you use your body? Like, are you exercising? Are you eating a good diet? What's your neurochemistry like? Let's say, does depression maybe run in your family? Do you have certain genetics that predispose you to depression? Are you, eating a diet that exposes you or builds serotonin in your gut? Are you getting enough sunlight so that way, like, your body is producing, the right neurotransmitters in your brain, and then that way those neurotransmitters are making you feel in a certain fashion, like hopefully in a good way. But if not, then maybe that might be the reason or a reason for the depression. So then we would look at the psychological bucket, if you will. And so that would be like, what are your thoughts like? What is your attitude in general, and like, what are your beliefs, right? So what do you think about yourself? What do you think about the world? What are you telling yourself on a daily basis? Like, are those thoughts dark? Are they pervasive? Are they sort of indicative that, like, things again are not going to change? That's something that, if so, we need to address as well. And then there's the final bucket, which is the social bucket. And so it's sort of a catch-all, which is basically like everything else in your life, your friends, your family, where you work, where you live, how you were raised, so on and so forth. And so the idea of the biopsychosocial model, and then also my book, right, is like bringing a holistic approach to depression, knowing that it has multiple inputs, and also knowing that when you change one of the inputs, so let's say, there's obviously, I'm trying to make sure that I thread the needle here. There are inputs, as in, like, you can change your diet, and that is an input. But let's say on a broad level, right, you can approach or attack the biological bucket, right? And as you change that biological bucket, that is going to have a trickle down effect to the psychological and the social as well. And so what ends up happening with this framework is that it's almost as if there's a synergy going on here, right? Where you change the biological, and that in turn changes the psychological and the social. If you then feel a little bit better, you might be like, hey, you know what? I'm going to go change the social as well, right? I'm going to go get a new job, something that I enjoy. I'm going to go make a new friend. And then that is in turn going to change the biological and the psychological. And so you get, again, this synergy where it's like we're trying to harness as many positive outlets as we can at the same time, and come up with this, 1 + 1 = 3 sort of equation. So that way we are building happiness back into our lives and into our minds. And, the thing that I caution with that book, I certainly try to provide the reader with a lot of actionable tactics, and just like, I try to think it out properly, and, make sure that I'm acting as like a consultant with the reader and being like, let's really tackle this and think about it critically and be honest about our approach here. And so I think there is a lot to take away from the book that is helpful at the same time, right? I don't sugarcoat anything. So I say, like, as we're thinking about the biological, the psychological, the social, you have to keep in mind, right? Like, these are big buckets. And so again, going back to what I said earlier, unlike anxiety, where it's like, hey, maybe you could do some deep breathing and feel better about your anxiety, like, immediately, it's going to take a while to rebuild these three large buckets, right? Unfortunately, you're not going to make a bunch of new friends overnight. And so that is just part of something that we have to accept going into the battle. That is kind of one side of the coin. The other is to also, I want to remind folks that, like, just because it can take some time to rebuild these things doesn't mean the battle is lost. Doesn't mean, we're never going to get there. We just kind of have to live in the middle of understanding that this is challenging on the one hand, but it's not irredeemable. Again, like we don't want to fall back into that same place of feeling as though things are helpless or we are helpless and things are hopeless, right? So giving people sort of like, I really try to give it to people straight and say, look, here are the facts. Here's what we're dealing with. It is hard, but we can do it. So like that's the lens through which I look at depression. And obviously if you want to jump into some of the more specific things about tackling it or like managing and living with depression as well, I'd be more than happy to. But that's the overall frame from which the second book arises.
Okay. Okay. So, what are some common misconceptions about anxiety and depression?
Yeah, for sure. So I think, I'd say the first one, right, is probably the most glaring, right, is that anxiety and depression and dealing with mental health challenges is a weakness. And I think that's it is a misconception, right? And I think what what goes on in society, right, is like it's sort of a what's the right word? It's a reflection, I think, of sort of the machismo society that we have built over time, right? And so, especially for dudes, right? It's like uh, we have all like those of us who have experienced anxiety and depression. We have learned from an early age that it's not okay to experience these things, right? And so then we internalize that belief, and we say to ourselves, hey, I'm experiencing anxiety, I'm experiencing depression. I'm not supposed to feel certain feelings. I'm going to push them down. And because I'm not supposed to feel these things, either consciously or subconsciously, I'm then saying to myself, like, because I have to push this down, because whatever forces society is telling me to, then it must be a weakness, right? And I think it's easier. It's probably easier to dispel this notion on the anxiety side. Not that it can't be done on the depression side, but it's like really easy to dispel on the anxiety side. And so, what I basically say here, and I'll try to keep it a little bit shorter, is so anxiety, like let's answer the question of like, where does anxiety come from? Why does it exist inside of us, right? And so you go back hundreds of thousands of years ago, millions of years ago, you think about evolution, right? And it's like, okay, back on the savannas of Africa, you think about natural selection and what traits evolved or got passed on through the bloodlines and through through our lineages, that were which traits got passed on that allowed us to live longer, right? That were advantageous for our survival. And so if you think about living in a jungle or on a savanna and outrunning predators, one of the traits that is like really beneficial in that kind of environment is either, having the ability to detect threat really quickly and run away from it when necessary, or being like, I guess the word would probably be like just being cunning, right? Always looking out and having an understanding that behind those bushes around that corner could lie, a serious threat. And so you run this, let's run kind of the course of human history or evolution or whatever. And you say, all right, so those of our ancestors that had a sensitive sensitive acute stress response more than likely lived on longer than those that did not, right? So if you are in the savannah and you hear a rustle in the bushes, like you may run and then it's a lion, and those that didn't run may now be lunch meat. You know what I mean? And so you play that all the way forward and you say, like, okay, so where does that get us to today? Again, going back to previous parts of the conversation and saying that anxiety is really similar to that acute stress response, you then say, okay, we now live in modern society. We still have that acute stress response within us, and yet we are not facing as many lions in our current day as our ancestors did long ago. And what does that do to us, or how does that make us feel, right? It's like, I guess to answer that question is basically to say that there are still proverbial threats or threats in our minds, right? We don't come across as many life or death threats in the flesh as we used to. But again, because we still have that acute stress response within us, our brains can pick up on a threat. So even if that's on social media, right? And it's like, oh man, this person's calling me out. They're calling me names. They're threatening to, ruin my career, whatever it is. Obviously, we're smart enough to pick that up and be like, that's a threat. I don't want that to be there. But unlike, a lion in front of us, we can't, it's hard to run away from some of these threats that, let's say live on the internet these days. And so what's the logical end of having an active acute stress response in a world where we can't actually run from or fight with a lot of the threats that come our way these days. I would say the logical end of that is anxiety, right? Where you're like, the wheels are spinning, the acute stress response keeps going, and yet I can't do anything about it. Rather than running away from that lion, even though it's terrifying and nobody wants to face a lion, at least you're out of that situation, and then the acute stress response powers down. Whereas if we're online and we're getting bullied all the time and whatnot, our brains again are seeing those threats, and yet they're like, dude, how am I supposed to turn this off? It keeps coming. I don't know where. I don't always know where it's coming from. I don't always know how to escape it. And now I'm sitting in bed, even not online, and I'm thinking to myself, oh goodness, what happens if I get bullied again, or if I'm online and I face another one of those threats? And so we go into this, obviously we are, some people will say, what's the difference between like an animal and a human? And it's like, we have the ability to plan for the future and think ahead and do all these great things in our minds. Yes, that is amazing. At the same time, the sort of other side of that coin is the fact that we can use that planning destructively to bring about more fears in our minds and accelerate our anxiety. And so what I would say, to bring this all the way back to like, why is anxiety not a weakness? It's literally a survival mechanism. If you weren't anxious, if your ancestors weren't anxious, you'd be dead. You would not be alive right now, right? And so from that standpoint, anxiety is literally not a weakness. It's very much the opposite. Now, you could certainly say that these days, it's an inconvenience, right? And it's not helping us as much as it used to, but it's certainly not a weakness. Depression, on the other hand, I think it's a little bit harder to talk about it. Like, it's also not a weakness, but it's a little bit harder to make that specific sort of connection to evolution and all that. What I think I would say, right, is depression feels like a weakness to the person, to everybody, right? Because you're like, I should be happy, I should be thriving, I should at least not feel horrible all the time. And so if I feel horrible and I'm having these bad emotions, like, how is that not a weakness? You know what I mean? What I would say is like, there's different kinds of depression, obviously, but like, here's one way we can look at it. If you lose your job, if you lose someone you love, if you lose a pet, if you are down in the dumps for any of those reasons, like major reasons, if you're also down in the dump for no reason at all, or seemingly no reason at all, I think we can say, well, especially for the more logical forms of depression, right? Where we're like, hey, I just lost a spouse, a loved one, whatever it may be. As brutal as it is to go through something like that, it makes sense that your body and your mind and your heart and your soul would all react in that fashion, right? It's like, would you really want your life to be turned upside down and not feel any kind of way? It's just a normal reaction, right? And so it's not a weakness. It's an indication that things have gone wrong, and that maybe you need to change things, but also like maybe you need to accept the new reality of whatever it is that you're dealing with, right? Again, if that's like having lost somebody, we're not going to bring them back. You know what I mean? There was one other piece that I was so the other piece that I was going to say there, right, was like, if everything is going to crap in your life, like you actually want to feel, maybe, I'm not saying anybody's asking for depression, but if everything is going to crap in your life, you want to react negatively because it's an indication that like, you want to change, right? It's like you need that feedback, that push in the wrong direction to be able to wake you up and say, wow, I lost my job. I'm having trouble paying my bills. I'm depressed because of all these things. These forces are pushing me into the corner and making me realize it's time to change. Otherwise, things are going to get really bad here. And so again, I don't see that as a weakness. It's really difficult to deal with, but it's certainly not a weakness. And so that is a long answer to one of the misconceptions about mental health, but let me pause there.
Okay. Yeah. So, what do you feel? So, being on the tech side, what role do you feel technology plays in both exacerbating and potentially alleviating mental health issues?
Yeah, I could probably talk for like many hours about this one, but I like to look at things sort of objectively, or at the very least, like rationally, like without emotion and without bias, like especially in terms of this question. And so what I often say there is like, everything comes with its pros and cons, right? And technology is no different than that. And so to talk that out a little bit, right, I would say technology is just a tool, and it can be positive and it can also be negative. And so if we think about the positivity that it can invoke on our mental health, right? It's like you can get on social media, you can get on email, you can text people. Like, technology has made it a lot easier for us to stay in touch with people that we used to not be able to stay in touch with, right? So it was like, if somebody moved to California and you lived in Connecticut, guess what? You probably never saw that person again. You before the internet, maybe you sent them a letter, but that's it. And that's a slow roll. And so
Right.
one of the very positive sides of technology is like, anytime you want, right? You can talk to your siblings, your parents, your cousins, your friends, and that's great. On the other side, right? Obviously, what we're seeing a lot more in the media these days of like, there's a book that came out recently by this author Jonathan Haidt. He's got a few other popular books, and so he wrote a book called The Anxious Generation, and his whole pitch is basically saying that like, we have sort of hijacked kids' childhoods, and it used to be where kids would have what he calls a play-based childhood, where it was like, you were 7 years old, you were 11 years old, you were out in the neighborhood playing street hockey, playing basketball, playing hopscotch, figuring out how to interact with everybody in the neighborhood, and basically like training yourself on like how to be a good member of the community and how to deal with conflict and have face-to-face conversations and all that. Really like develop yourself as a person, right? And these days when I say that we've kind of stolen childhood from kids, Jonathan Haidt basically said that we are now exposing them to what we would call a phone-based childhood. So instead of kids going outside and getting, fresh air and playing with other kids in the neighborhood all the time, and that being the primary way that they live outside of being in school, they're on their iPads, they're on their video games, they're on their phones, and maybe they're on social media, maybe they're on YouTube, whatever it may be. And the effects are really starting to take their toll on young kids where, they're not learning as much as they used to. A lot of them have serious bouts of, mental illness. There's the rates of anxiety and depression have gone way up. I mean, some of the stats around like girls and suicide or just like suicidal ideation are like absolutely horrifying. And so like, I would definitely encourage folks who are listening to look at some of that research and maybe definitely read Jonathan Haidt's book if you're interested. And so like, again, I could talk about this for hours. I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but there's a lot of dangers with technology as well, right? So I don't know what the right word is, but I'm sort of a rationalist, right? Where I'm trying to be like, I try to see both sides of the argument. And where I always come back to is moderation, where it's like, I don't think it behooves us to shut off all technology and get rid of all of it and go back to like, living out in the forest or whatever it is. That nobody would want to do that. And also like, there are clear benefits, a couple of which I just talked about, right? With technology, where it's like, we don't want to give that up. And also it makes life better. At the same time, if we use technology too much, and if we're using it in the wrong ways, then it affects our mental health. It makes us anxious. It makes us depressed. It isolates us from other people. We lose the ability, or we don't gain the ability to have conversations with people that then further isolates us, which, has an effect on our mental health, and so on and so forth. So you get sometimes to these downward spirals, if you will. And so again, my approach is like, with all of these things that come with pros and cons, we need to be careful that we are in the middle somewhere, right? We want to make sure that, hey, we're using it in the positive fashion. So it's like, if it helps you connect with your friends and your roommates and your family, that's awesome. But if you're looking around and you're like, hey, I'm on social media 6 hours a day and I'm anxious and I'm depressed and I'm wondering, what the purpose of my life is and whatnot, that's when you need to step back and analyze your technology use and see if like maybe probably, things are not going in the direction that you want them to. So I don't know, kind of a bit of a rant, but I'm like, we want to make sure that we stay in the middle and we are getting the positive effects of that technology while not, I don't know what the right word is, while not falling prey to some of the negative things, because they're both there and they're both for the taking, but it can be really difficult these days where like technology is so pervasive and it's so easy, right? And I'm not casting judgment on anyone. It's so easy, for myself included, get into bed, open Instagram, open TikTok, whatever it is, scroll for an hour. But just because it's easy doesn't mean that it's necessarily right, nor is it right for our mental health.
Right. No, I agree. I mean, and that's where, you have to, I think earlier the word you were looking for was awareness. That's where you have to have the awareness of what you're doing at all times. Like sometimes it's easy, like you said, it's easy to get sucked in and like, oh man, you're scrolling like TikTok, for example. When it came out, that's why everybody's trying to be like TikTok, not a short form content. You start watching it, and then next thing you know, you've been scrolling for an hour. You don't watch 50 videos, or whatever the case is. So yeah, it's definitely easy to get sucked in, but just trying to have that awareness to get out of it and get back to reality and try to because especially late at night, your brain needs that rest. So you don't want to cut your sleep short because of social media for sure.
Yeah, no doubt. And I guess last thing to put a bow on that, right, is there's a lot of research and studies showing that like having screen time and having, blue light coming from the devices can also affect your sleep cycles. And so it's like, and I struggle with this too, right? Because it's very easy to get into bed and to open those devices. But I also notice that like if I'm on my computer late at night, I can't fall asleep as easily. And so I think for folks, right, just thinking about that, having that awareness, making sure that it's like, hey, if you get into bed and you're on social media, it might make you feel worse, but also under the hood, you might be getting this blue light into your eyes that then is affecting how you sleep and making the problem even worse. So just, have some caution. That's all.
Right. So, do you have maybe like a specific tech inspired strategy that readers have found particularly helpful that you know of?
Um, I it's funny because even though like that is part of my brand is talking about the technology and whatnot, it's more like a theme that's in the background, so to speak, and I'll make those connections just to give like what was kind of fun for me, I guess, or rewarding for me, right? Was I gave the example earlier of recursion and writing software and functions that call themselves. And even though that's like a very technical thing to talk about, you gave it back to me and you were like, I understand you got a robot, you're picking apples and so on and so forth. When I can make those connections for folks and they can understand them, to me, I'm like, awesome. That's exactly what I'm trying to do. Right. And the risk I run is if I'm too technical, like nobody's going to understand me. And
Right.
technology and, sort of just being in the tech world, it's sort of I don't know what the right word is. It's just a niche thing where it's like, I don't want to paint myself in a corner where I'm just the tech guy and I'm
Right.
talking about too complicated of things, right? So I do bring the text into the books and the blogs and all that, but I do have to be careful that I'm not just talking to, software developers. My goal is to help a larger community than just that. And so I wouldn't say that I necessarily have a specific tactic that is geared toward the software side of things. I try to infuse the writing with some of the themes from software while still making it approachable enough to, I, excuse me for the wrong term. I'll say like everyday folks, lay people, whatever it is, just
Yeah.
folks who are not necessarily in technology all the time.
Mhm.
If you want to talk about, I can pull a few of those out and we can talk about them. But yeah, it's like I'm trying to infuse the tech, but not do it so much that it's like, hey, I've sort of pigeonholed myself, and my market is very small.
Gotcha. Okay, so far, so how many books have you written so far?
There's two so far.
Two so far. Okay. So what type of feedback have you been receiving from your readers about from your readers who've applied your strategies?
Yeah. So, I wouldn't sit here and be like, oh, it's all negative. Across the board has been pretty positive, which I'm thankful for. I'm grateful for. I think one of the things is like, it's probably more an like the volume of feedback is kind of the main measurement, if you will. As you hear from more and more people, it means that it's having an impact. If you are like, unless you write the worst book of all time and it's really offensive, you're probably not going to get that much feedback from folks on the negative side. But so I've gotten some good feedback. I've gotten a decent amount of feedback, and that's been encouraging. And it's like, at the end of the day, I just want to know that I'm helping people and what I'm doing is working. One thing that one story that I share that on a lot of podcasts that was really moving and rewarding for me was I had a reader email, like he read my book, emailed me. And I was kind of one of those where I saw the email in my inbox. I couldn't even really tell. I was like, is this a work email or I'm not, do I know this email address or do I not? And then I opened it. It's this long story about, all the things that the reader took away from my book and how he was in, a not so great place mentally. And then after reading it, he was in much better spirits and, was ready to, sort of pick back up at work and really give it some effort and resolve relationships and his marriage and all that. And then he had a picture that was attached to the email, and it was him, having just got home from the tattoo parlor, with the snake brain that you can see behind me, tattooed on his chest. And he was like, I enjoyed this book so much, it made such an impact on me that I was like, all right, tattoo artist, like, put this on me, and it's going to be a reminder of what this book helped me do and how it helped me change my life. And obviously that's like a shameless plug there, and a little bit of a brag, but like, it was really inspiring, because it was like, at the end of the day, it would be awesome to sell a ton of books and, be able to make a living off of this and whatnot. But what I'm really trying to do is just help individual people in their journey with mental illness. Right. And to get that email, it was like, man, like, not that I hadn't gotten other emails before, but that was the most profound. And it was like, to be able to get that out of a reader, it's like, whoa, that, I would say, mission accomplished, if you will, or at least, like, again, on the right track. So that was really, really rewarding to read.
Okay. Okay. Cool. So, can you discuss the importance of system maintenance, in both technology and mental health? Like, is there a way that you tie those two together? Or maybe have an example where you can tie it from the tech world to the mental health world.
For sure. I have not answered this question like in my books before, but I will absolutely play ball here and try to give you a good answer. So system maintenance, right? Thinking about, like, let's say we run an application, or we build and host an application. Like, let's say we build Instagram, and we are writing new features and we're deploying them out into the world and all that. So you have your entire tech stack, right? Which would be the mobile app itself, like the software program where the code lives, and the code lives that powers the app, and then also where you write new code. You also have your servers where, like, back end code is hosted, and you run web services and all that. You might have some security analysis, or like some security tools where, if there's a unwanted actor in the system and they are trying to hack into accounts or do sort of nefarious things, you might get alerted to some of those things. And so there's, like, in software development, I won't break it all the way down, but if we think in a couple loose buckets, we say, like, there's feature development, right? Which is like, we are going to put a new feature into our app. We're going to write it in code. We're going to make sure it looks good in our app. And then we're going to send that off to the app store, and that will get approved, and everybody who has the app will be able to download it. The same thing kind of goes for the back end side, right? Where it's like, if we need to save a photo, we got to get that off of our device and upload it to the cloud, if you will. So there needs to be some way that our server or a remote computer can accept that image, store it, and all that. And so feature development is much different than sort of like system maintenance, right? So system maintenance is more like, okay, every once in a while, we need to go through and make sure that the practices that we're adhering to are up to snuff with, like, how we want them to be. And we need to make sure that, like, our code has not taken on so much tech debt. I'll kind of explain that in a minute, that it is slowing us down and slowing the product down and making it unsafe for users, and just overall giving a poor experience, right? So tech debt is sort of like when you cut corners in your software, and eventually that stacks up such that it makes it harder to write new features, because you're like, oh, we're doing it in this kind of weird way, and I could streamline things, but that would take me more time if I wanted to maintain it and all that. So system maintenance, right? It's like making sure that everything is running smoothly in your application, or, like, just your system, your computer system, whatever it is, without actually doing anything new. So again, that's going through and being like, kind of running through a checklist and saying, hey, are the things that, my server adhering to the latest technologies? Is it secure? Am I on the latest version of the operating system on the mobile device, or whatever it is? So you're going through and you're trying to make sure that, like, I was going to say house of cards, but that's the wrong one. The house that you have built is not on an unsteady foundation, right? You want to make sure that, like, the system that you have created is secure, and it's built for the future, and it's made such that, like, nothing's going to just break willy-nilly, right? And so I guess to try to play ball here and think about, like, all right, how do we compare that to our mental health? I guess it would sort of be like, every once in a while, going through and evaluating your life a little bit critically, right? We talked earlier about the different buckets of the biopsychosocial model. and just kind of running through and being honest with yourself and saying like, hey, today, where am I at? Or like this month or the last 3 months, where am I at in my biological health, my psychological health, my social health, or like how am I feeling about those buckets? Because as we've shown, right, like when those buckets are out of line, so to speak, we might predispose ourselves to depression. We might also want to take a look around and say, like, again, this is maintenance in the sense that we are making sure that everything is running how it's supposed to. So we would look around and we would also be critical, like, I guess everything stems or is a subset of biopsychosocial, right? So within those buckets, we could say, let's just look at social. We'll say, hey, how are my friendships doing these days? What's my work life like? And really be honest and critical about those things and say, hey, rather than, like trying to start a new project, like a new work project or a side hustle or whatever it is, let me harness and cultivate what I already do have. Let me maintain those friendships that I have such that, they support my mental health. And that way, like when I go to call a friend, he actually picks up. Whereas, like, if I don't call him for a few years, he might be like, the heck with this guy. Why don't I move on here or whatever it is? So it's important not only like, I guess one other way or one other thing I want to talk about here, right, is like it's important to look at your mental health from a lot of different angles and levels and perspectives. And so in my first book around anxiety, the first half of the book is really on the low level of like, hey, you are anxious right now. How can you, or what strategy could you enlist that would help you be less anxious in 5 minutes from now, 10 minutes from now, maybe 30 seconds from now, right? That is sort of more of again, that's the low level. And that's like, right now, we got to change something, whatever. There's also the medium level, the high level, and obviously the gradients kind of, or the levels blend into one another. But I think if you zoom all the way out and you think about the high level, you say to yourself, like, am I living constantly in a stressful world or a stressful environment? Like, do I show up to work every day and I'm in a hostile environment where that work environment is making me anxious? Are the relationships that I have cultivated in my life, are they supporting me or are they making me anxious too? Do I come home and walk on eggshells? And so again, looking like where I'm going with this is the maintenance piece is more of that high level component to go through and kind of check the boxes or at the very least, like use a proverbial checklist to say, how is the system health of my friends? How is the system health of my finances? How is the system health of my job? And then how are those things affecting my mental health? Because obviously they all will, right? It's like if you are broke, you're probably going to be pretty anxious as to like, how are you going to pay your next bill? And so again, it's sort of just being able to have some process, some protocol where just as you would go through your tech stack and you would say, yep, the back end looks good, the front end looks good, our automated tests look good and all that, you would then go over into your own life and you would say, hey, my friendships are doing pretty well right now and they are supporting my mental health. You know what? My job is kind of not doing that right now. So maybe I need to go have a conversation with my boss. If I'm self-employed, maybe I need to think about like, should I be changing the way that I approach my business and so on and so forth. So again, what I'm really getting at here is like the maintenance piece, the system maintenance piece is that really high level approach of saying like, from a 10,000 foot view, do these things look good? And then if they kind of don't, then you start to zoom in some more and approach them or change them as necessary.
Right. So almost kind of like you go into your fridge and you make a checklist of everything that's missing out of your fridge that you need to go to the grocery store and get. So your checklist is, hey, if I get these things, it's gonna fill my fridge up and I'm gonna be happy. So you treat that like your life. Okay, what's in my life that's not correct? Let me check the list off. Okay. If these things aren't correct, what do I need to do to correct those things so that way now my mental health benefits from it?
For sure. And I guess the additional piece, right, is like once you've established that process once, then you can pretty much just run that process, let's say every 3 months or whatever it may be. I talk about in my in the second book, the book on depression, I talk about how there are a lot of again, going into the factors on depression, it's like, you may say like, hey, how are my finances? How's my spirituality? How's my physical health and all that stuff? I give actually there's a like a free giveaway in that book that runs folks through a process of being able to give themselves a score in these different areas of their life. And the goal, right, is like, I guess I'll give you a little more information here. Is the book is called Get Out of Your Head Volume 2, Navigating the Abyss of Depression. So there's a lot of nautical imagery there. And I'm talking about sailing ships and how that, the sort of vague metaphor connects to like living life in general and event, once in a while, sailing your ship over to a whirlpool, and that whirlpool representing depression, or kind of symbolically representing depression. And so with that process, or with that, the sort of giveaway that I have in the book, what I'm having folks do is run through a process where they score themselves in the most important areas of their lives. And what I'm trying to tell them, right, is like, think as though, I call this the life helm diagram. So the helm is sort of like, when they say you're at the helm, right, you're in front of the wheel on the ship. You've got the steering wheel in front of you, or you're trying to steer yourself in different places, right, in the ocean, right. And so I say, like, pretend as though this exercise, at the end of it, you are going to create a helm. You're going to create a wheel, the steering wheel on your own ship. And so if you say, hey, I'm a 10 out of 10 in all these areas, you'll basically build a pie chart where you've got a complete circle and it's a full wheel. And that's going to represent your steering wheel in the wheel of life and your ability to navigate through difficult things like depression. If, however, you're a 3 in one area, a 10 in another, a 2 in another, and a 9 in another, you've got this imbalanced wheel where it's like you're going to go look for the next peg on the wheel to figure out where and how to navigate yourself away from difficult things like depression. You're going to be like, oh goodness, can't find the notch there. Oh, well, I guess I'm going into the depression, right? So again, a lot of imagery and symbolism there, but it's what I'm basically trying to do for folks is basically what we just walked through, right? Is help folks come up with a protocol for doing that high level system maintenance analysis. I know those are a lot of words there, but like in their own lives. And then I invite folks, I'm like, hey, once you have that document that I send you, right, the life helm diagram process or document or whatever it is, that's yours. And you can pull it out every 3 months. In fact, I invite you, I welcome you to do that. And then that way it's like, you just put it on, you set your watch to it, you put it on your calendar, whatever it may be. And then every quarter or every month or whatever you feel comfortable with, you feel is necessary, you're getting that checklist out and you're saying, I'm doing well here. I'm doing well here. I'm not doing well here. And maybe this is opening my eyes to an area where I will then not be able to steer myself properly. And that may lead me to negative feelings such as depression. So I'm going to pause because I talked too long. But that, yeah, again, coming up with the process, coming up with the protocol and running it in a maintenance style fashion, that is what we're after.
Okay. So do you have, so I know you already have 2 books that are already published. Are you working on any more?
I'm not working on one at the moment. I wrote my first book in 2017, released it in 2018. That was the first thing that I ever truly wrote. Like, it was like I wrote a lot of papers in college and high school, and I have my blog and I've had a previous blog and whatnot, but that was the first major thing and first book I ever published. And so I look back on it now and I say, like, it's amazing that it has been able to help a lot of people. At the same time, my writing has improved a lot. And so I am going back and touching that up and doing kind of a second edition of that first book, if you will. The goal is that for me, right? I'm like, I come on a lot of podcasts. I talk to a lot of folks. It's possible that they download that first book and maybe it's not quite where it needs to be, right? And then they're like, I'm not going to finish this book. I know I only get so many chances to proverbially stand in front of people and deliver my message. And so I see an opportunity to improve that first message, as in, the first book. And so that's where I'm dedicating my efforts right now, in hopes that maybe the pipeline, if you will improve, of like more people will listen to me, more people will then pick up that book and then say, hey, I liked what he had to say here. Let me go pick up the next book. So that's where I'm focusing right now, which, I'll be totally honest, is a little tough because it's like, I wish I could come on and talk about like a new and exciting, like a net new project and be like, hey guys, like there's, build excitement and energy around a new book that's coming out, but I'm just not there at the moment. At the same time, it's like these 2 books, the anxiety and the depression book, like these are, man, this is like, I never want to be in a place where I'm just writing for the sake of publishing a book. When I have something to say, I will say it. So like, you can feel very confident that if you pick up either of these books, like I am saying what I want to say, and I think it's delivering value. So that's where my head's at right now.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, this writing books is, I feel like it's a great thing because there's a lot of readers out here that they may not be able to watch this podcast episode and really take from it as much as they could if they actually read it on paper. So I feel like it's definitely something that's still needed out here. People writing books and especially concerning mental health. I mean, people, they'll take their 10-minute, 15-minute break at work and they'll sit there and they'll read a book.
Yeah, no doubt. And I just as so I come from like, coming from the tech world and also coming from sort of like the design side of things or the user experience, I know that I'm like, hey, if I want to sell products and I want to get my message into people's hands, I need to deliver a lot of different mediums, right? So it's like, I love writing books and it's awesome that folks can read those books. At the same time, like I know that a lot of people will listen to your podcast and during that 15-minute break at work, they might be like, hey, this is an hour long. I'll put it on 2X. I'll get through half of it. I'll get through the other half on the way home from work, whatever. So I was like, I'm trying to make sure that I'm delivering good quality content to folks on podcasts, on blogs, on books, whatever it may be, because I don't know where somebody's going to come from. So I
Right.
I totally agree with you that books are very important. It's awesome to be able to give folks something to dig their teeth into on the reading front. But I'm like, hey, I don't want to lose anybody,
Yeah, I understand. So, anything else that you want to share with the listeners before we get ready to get up out here?
So here's where I'm at, right? I feel like I talked a lot. I don't know how many like actionable concrete tactics I gave to the listener. So why don't I throw one out there and then we'll break.
Okay, that's fine.
Cool. So here's a quick one, right? So on the anxiety front, right? It's like, all right, so you are feeling anxious, you're feeling stressed out, you're feeling fearful. What is a way that you can walk that back, right? And I have a chapter in my first book where I talk about the power of distraction. And so one of the things about our minds, right, is they're very cunning and they're tricky. And when negative thoughts pop into our minds, it's almost as if they're like coming in front of us and saying, hey, look, Brian, hey, look, Alex, look at me, listen to me, believe me. You know what I mean? And the difficulty with that is like often it feels as though we really should believe them. And then we do, right? And we're like, oh, yeah, maybe I am a loser. Maybe I am an idiot, whatever it is. And we buy into those beliefs. And it's very hard to actually fight off those beliefs and be like, I'm not an idiot. I'm not a loser. Like that just doesn't really work because you're actually, you're giving credibility to that negative thought and allowing it to exist, to live, to stick around. So one of the things that I say is rather than try to fight that difficult battle of being like, nope, like resist you, get out of here, whatever it is, I think it can be really important to just turn your mind elsewhere. And so that's where I talk about the power of distraction, right? So and again, because I don't recommend that you fight, your negative thoughts, just go do something else. So what I really say in that book is find the activities that are most interesting and engaging to you. And then when you can, dive into them, right? So like maybe you like working out, maybe you like doing yoga, running, whatever it may be. If you're starting to have, a little bit of an episode or you're feeling anxious, go to the gym. If you can't go to the gym, walk around the block. If you can't walk around the block, do 10 push-ups or sit-ups at your desk. Do something that shifts your mind away from those thoughts and allows you to break free from the chains that those thoughts are trying to enwrap you in, right? There are obviously other ways that you can distract yourself as well. So you could socialize with a friend. You could go grab lunch or coffee with somebody. Again, you could move your body, even if it's just get up and jump up and down for a couple seconds. You could also potentially, like if you were feeling ambitious, you could be like, hey, you know what? I'm going to set a goal for myself today. And if I start feeling anxious, I'm just going to remember that goal and I'm going to go do something that moves me in the direction of that goal. So again, in sum, it's basically don't fight those negative thoughts because that battle is just not one that you're going to win. However, what you can do is you can turn away from those thoughts. And once you stop focusing on them so much and sort of drop yourself in to that healthfully distractful activity that you're going to engage in, all of a sudden, we hope, the thoughts will go away, the anxiety will mitigate, and then you'll be doing this fun thing that is helping you feel better. And so, yeah, distraction is sort of the capstone to this discussion, if you will.
Okay. Sounds good. I hope everybody, definitely takes time to try to apply some of those techniques and then take time to actually, go and support you by purchasing the book and reading it. And maybe they'll learn a thing or two about where they're at in their life as far as mental health and, and they can apply some of those techniques and improve their mental health at the same time. So I definitely appreciate you for taking the time out of your busy schedule because I know you have a lot going on. for coming on here and having a chat with me.
Yeah, no problem, man. I hope it was helpful. Again, I know I talk a lot, so apologies for going long, but thanks for having me.
Nah, you're fine. I don't interrupt people when they're talking because it's I'm all about context, and whatever your answer to the question is, there's context around that, and I wouldn't want to mess that context up by interrupting anyone. So
Cool. Well, it was a fun conversation. I hope folks get a lot out of it.
yeah, I'm pretty sure it will. So you guys that are watching, you guys go to the description and you go and support Brian with everything he has going on. Follow him on social media, all that, and you guys have just watched another episode of All in All with Alex. We'll see you guys on the next episode. Peace.